recording. Be told it's doing its thing. Okay. Right. Well, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Miranda Mockrin of the U.S. Forest Service, and to join us today to talk about the wildland-urban interface and fires across that landscape, and just sort of aspects of the integration of wildland and urban land, which is not just a U.S. thing; it's all over the world. But it's a fascinating topic in Geographies of Risk, because we've seen it's been in the news a lot certainly in the last couple of years. The big coverage here was certainly American coverage was happening, but there were also lots of Australian examples that people were following very closely. So it's a great pleasure to have you here. I cold called you a couple of years ago, I guess. So we have yet to meet in person, but this is it's such a pleasure that this that correspondence continues to evolve. So thank you for joining us for this special seminar.
Great. Well, no, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. Normally, I think one of the best things about giving seminars is that you get to chat with people afterwards. And since that's unfortunately not the case, I've made sure to put my email here, and please do feel free to follow up. I'd love to sort of continue the conversation. And I particularly welcome this opportunity because, as you'll sort of see through this talk, I'm sort of situated in a natural resource management agency. I primarily focus on wildfire and sort of social science. And it's a nice opportunity to be able to sort of chat more with the broader hazards scholarship community. So I also want to make sure to acknowledge the collaborators I've listed here. All of this work I'm going to talk about has very much been a group effort. Particularly want to thank Volker Radloff at University of Wisconsin and Sue Stewart, formerly with the Forest Service. Okay, so a quick overview today. I think given that we are in different continents, oftentimes think about different hazards, I thought I would start with some background information, touch base on wildfire issues globally, talk about the US setting. I also thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about the role of my home agency and the role I play as a research scientist for the Forest Service. And then I want to talk about sort of two areas of research. One is a long-term effort to track the wildland-urban interface. And in the US, we're thinking about that as the area where we have housing in close proximity to wildland vegetation. And then I also want to talk about some research we've done looking at how communities are adapting to wildfire. So if you've been unfortunate enough to have a fire occur, you've lost buildings, what kind of changes are we seeing afterwards, with an emphasis on land use and the built environment. So moving now into background, I think you've probably all seen a lot of headlines recently about wildfire issues globally, much of this activity being fueled by climate change, right? So we're seeing unprecedented fire activity in that we're seeing larger fires, we are seeing more extreme fire behavior, we're seeing extending fire seasons, that time of year during which we see fires. And if you think about these events, they can really have very large scale consequences. For example, in terms of air quality, meteorological phenomena, carbon sequestration, right? Wildfires are having sort of continental to global consequences. I think as hazard scholars, though, you're probably most interested in those places where we're seeing losses from wildfire. So, unfortunately, human loss of life or damage to the built environment. And those are the types of settings where I'm typically working. Again, in the US, we think about this by calling it the wildland-urban interface, housing in close proximity to wildland vegetation. So we have the housing and the people on the landscape. They oftentimes cause the ignitions. The wildland vegetation is there and sufficient to be fuel. Firebrands can then sort of return back into developed areas. And in some places, if houses are in close proximity, we can even have house-to-house fire spread. And so I think these wildland-urban interface or WUI losses are also happening around the globe, right? So the past decade, we've seen record-setting losses in Canada, Australia, the US, closer to home, Portugal and Greece have both had really devastating wildfire seasons in the past couple of years. So that's a quick overview of sort of the global picture. And the US certainly is not immune to these trends. So when it comes to the area burned in the US, we've actually seen the area burned the annual average area burned in the US has basically doubled since the 1990s. And the image here on the left is showing you the size and the timing for the largest wildfires in California's recorded history. And you can see here that although this record goes back to the 1930s, it's sort of striking how many of the largest fires have occurred in the past 2 decades, and also how unusual 2020 was in terms of size of wildfires. We're also seeing increasing losses, of course, as well. So this figure here on the right is from a national all hazards database. It's just showing you the number of events for which there were measurable losses or human casualties. So certainly not a perfect measure of losses, but again, as well, we're seeing those losses increase. And this is happening in the US for really sort of a suite of reasons, many of which are sort of interrelated. But if I had to sort of touch base on sort of the top 3, I would say obviously climate change, right? We're seeing longer fire seasons, more extreme fire behavior. We also in the US are dealing with a legacy of decades of wildfire suppression or exclusion on the landscape. So my home agency, the Forest Service, we're really closely associated with our most popular mascot, Smokey Bear. And this poster here on the left is from the 40s, showing sort of how wildfire was thought about initially, right? So there's this idea that fire is wasting timber and that this is actually sort of a national security concern. We've obviously have really sort of rethought the role of fire. There's a lot of recognition about the sort of ecological benefits of fire. Smokey has been sort of updated there on the right. He's talking about just, preventing unintentional wildfires. But we still have sort of a lot of overgrowth and sort of accumulation of fuels that have happened on public lands where we've had wildfires suppressed. And then we've also had this third point here. We've had a lot of residential development in the US. And again, if this happens in proximity to wildland vegetation, we're calling it WUI. So I've put up here 2 maps. One is showing housing density in the US in the 1940s, and the other showing what housing density looked like by 2010. And I wanted to do this for a couple of reasons. First, wanted to remind everyone that the US is a large country with a relatively low population and housing density, right? Even still. I think another thing worth noticing here is that although these red areas, these sort of highest housing density urban cores, the footprint has obviously increased from the 1940s to 2010, but it's been relatively modest, particularly if you compare it to the growth in terms of area that we've seen for these lower density development. So for example, ex-urban development, sprawl development in rural areas. We've seen a lot of sort of changes in how we're building housing and how we're using land in the US. And again, this has happened for many different reasons. We've had, since the 1940s, we've had the baby boom. We have had changing household sizes in the US. We tend to live with smaller numbers of people in houses now. We've had sort of dramatic changes in sort of transportation, where we work, if we commute to work. And also starting in the 1970s, we've had sort of a real uptick in some of our rural areas with natural amenities in housing development. So this idea that people want to have vacation homes or primary homes in areas where they have access to forests, mountains, lakes. And so we sort of, particularly starting in the 1970s, saw that type of growth start to increase. And I also want to point out too that a lot of these housing sort of trends are sort of consistent across the US in places with natural amenities, and that we are also concerned about wildfire in many places in the US. So this map here on the left is showing you where we have the potential for wildfire from a sort of biophysical point of view, so sort of where the vegetation communities can support wildfire. And you'll see here that we have the potential for fire in much of the West, the Great Plains of Texas and Oklahoma, the Southeast, even the upper Midwest. And I think you see this potential reflected in the map on the right, showing you where we've had buildings lost due to wildfire. So I know California, sort of makes the news. We also had really devastating losses this year in Oregon and Washington. But if you look at this figure on the right, this is from a recent publication by Michael Caggiano and colleagues, and they're just showing where over the past 2 decades buildings have been destroyed due to wildfire and the relative sort of size of the loss. And you can see here that we've had losses really throughout the US, not just California, but throughout the West, the Great Plains of Texas and Oklahoma, the Southeast, even the upper Midwest. So this really is sort of a national issue. And then that brings me to sort of my home agency, sort of how does the Forest Service fit into this? So the mission of the Forest Service is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forest and grasslands. And they do this by working with both publicly owned land and privately owned land. So the figure here in the darker green is showing you publicly owned forests. Much of those are the national forests. The national forests and grasslands make up about 8% of the land base, and the Forest Service is an agency directly manages those lands. They also, though, because the mission is talking about the nation's forests and grasslands, they also provide funding to states, which then in turn are sort of working with local governments, private landowners, and in that way sort of influencing the health and productivity of privately owned forests. And you can see here on this map too, those privately owned forests are really extensive in the eastern part of the US. And the reason this all relates to fire is because when the national forests were first established a century ago, again, there was this really strong emphasis on providing timber, maintaining water quality, and sort of accomplishing those goals by excluding fire on the landscape. And what this meant was that the Forest Service became sort of the national leader in wildfire management and suppression, both directly managing federal lands and providing funding to states. And that sort of role remains to this day. Obviously, the policies have been revisited, but in many ways, too, the Forest Service is the federal agency that still pays for much of the sort of federal expenditure on wildfire suppression. And we sort of serve a critical coordinating role within the federal government and with states. The policies, as I mentioned, have changed. They are now to really sort of live with fire. So the goal of our sort of national wildfire strategy is to have safe and effective suppression when necessary. We want to use fire when allowable. We want those natural resource management benefits. And we want to, as a nation, live with fire. And I would say my work really sort of emphasizes or focuses on this idea of living with fire, both sort of tracking the area where we're living with fire and thinking about how we are going to, as a nation, sort of adapt to and live with this concern. I also want to mention that as a research scientist, I don't have direct management responsibilities for national forest or grassland. There's about 400 of us. We're in a separate branch, the research and development branch. We do work on all kinds of natural resource management related disciplines. And we do that work in collaboration with managers, states, local governments. Many of us in some way sort of touch upon wildfire, again, given that it is such a broad concern at this point. And then one last slide on background, I would be remiss if I did not point out that there are many things the Forest Service does not do. So when it comes to actually permitting housing development, saying like, okay, you can develop land or doing land use planning, that really falls to the role of local government in the US. So counties, cities, towns. So this image here on the left is showing you, those are also the entities that are doing the education and outreach. So Living with Fire in Sonoma County. This is county in California. They've produced this brochure and they're doing education and outreach to their homeowners. They may have received some federal funding along the way to put these resources together, but they're really taking the lead in doing this. And then also once a fire occurs and it has been extinguished, the Forest Service doesn't really play much of a role in sort of the social recovery. We work on ecological recovery of national forests and grasslands. We collaborate obviously with sort of landowners nearby. But when it comes to an individual homeowner who has unfortunately lost their home, they're dealing with their private homeowner's insurance. And if the disaster has been big enough to be recognized as a sort of federally declared disaster, they're working with the Federal Emergency Management Agency and with local government on sort of restoring those public and private sort of losses. So I know that's a lot, but that's sort of what I've got on the background, and hopefully that helps set the stage. I then want to transition into talking about research. So the first effort I want to talk about is a long-term effort I've been involved with, trying to map where we have this wildland-urban interface. And so again, this is a term that really sort of came out of the fire community. It's been around for a while, but particularly about 20 years ago, after we had another sort of really bad wildfire season, there was sort of this increased push to say, we have to sort of try and think about and more consistently track these areas. Where are we having this housing development? And so there was this definition published in the Federal Register, and much of the work that we've done in collaboration with the University of Wisconsin has been sort of taking this definition, operationalizing it, and mapping change over time. I want to make sure to mention too that from a fire concern, we are interested in knowing about housing development for sort of two reasons. And the first is that when you build houses in areas with forest and wildland vegetation, you actually increase the likelihood of ignition. So most ignitions in the US are now human caused. They tend to follow development. And so as you have more people there, the likelihood of fire increases. And then once a fire event does occur, you now have all these homes and resources on the landscape that you have to try and protect. People have to evacuate, and makes wildfire suppression more complicated and more challenging. I think in this regard, fire is perhaps a bit analogous to flooding, and that if you sort of build houses in floodplains, they are at risk to that sort of hazard, but also the housing development itself, for example, can change infiltration and stormwater management and sort of worsen the hazard. I also want to mention too that we're concerned about wildland urban interface growth, not just from a fire perspective, but because of all the other sort of ecological ramifications that can happen when you build housing within forested environments. And I also think, given the strong preference that many people in the US have shown for sort of living in proximity to these amenities, too, this is also sort of an important environment to further understand from a social point of view. Sort of, there's a lot of things, I think, motivating homeowners to value and invest in these sort of environments. So many different reasons why this is an important environment to understand. Sort of getting back to this particular sort of fire concern and the definition that first came out in the Federal Register, it really did a number of key things, but one of them was it established the idea that we were going to look for housing at a density of 1 home per 40 acres or more. That's about 6.2 housing units per square kilometer. And again, the idea here is that if we have very rural, low density housing development, these are not perhaps the areas where we're seeing the increases in ignitions and the challenges with suppression. We need to sort of look for a certain kind of level of development. And so from there, we went and looked to see if the housing was intermingled with or adjacent to wildland vegetation. And for doing this work, we are taking data from the decennial census in the US. These are these somewhat sort of irregular polygons. It would be nice if we had a nationally consistent, updated data set of building footprints in the US over time. We do not have that. We have one data set from about 2015 that Microsoft has produced of building footprints, but again, no sort of nationally consistent housing footprint data set that's updated over time. So we're using these data at the level of the census block and then doing some processing to figure out if housing is adjacent to or intermingled to wildland vegetation using remotely sensed vegetation. And so we're sort of putting these things together, looking for both where we have housing intermingled with or adjacent to wildland vegetation. You know, there's sort of a fair amount that goes into this. So I'm going to keep this kind of brief and happy to chat more with people offline or in follow-up. But basically, we're looking for areas where we either have intermingling, this sort of top line here, or at the bottom, an interface, meaning that the housing development itself perhaps does not retain a lot of wildland vegetation, but you're in proximity to a sizable area of wildland vegetation, meaning that you could have, for example, firebrands being sort of dispersed. And so we've put these two data sets together, housing coming from the census, wildland vegetation coming from the National Land Cover Database, and we sort of put them all together in the geography of 2010 census blocks and map change over time from 1990 to 2000 to 2010. The 2020 census is currently still being tabulated and processed by the Census Bureau, and so we're looking forward to updating that when it's released. And so then looking at sort of what this looks like in the US, what does the wildland urban interface look like? These are the most recent data we have from 2010. And the yellow and the orange are where we have housing either adjacent to or intermingled with wildland vegetation, respectively. So I know it's a lot to take in, and it's actually a little bit hard to see at this scale, I think, the sort of extent or footprint. So I've got some follow-up slides. But in general, this makes up about 10% of our land area and about 1/3 of the housing units in the US. I should say, too, we only have the data right now for the conterminous US. There are some sort of different ways in which housing density data is sort of provided for Alaska that makes it a little bit more challenging, although we're always hoping that we will be able to expand to Alaska and Hawaii. And we currently have some colleagues who are underway mapping the WUI for Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. So this is what the WUI looks like for 2010. And again, it's pretty extensive in the East Coast, which I think, you know, makes sense given the sort of long history of housing development there, the abundance of forest vegetation. much of it privately owned. But also then to looking sort of at a finer grain level, this allows us to see as well that this type of housing really is prevalent in the US, particularly in the West and in the East. So this map here is showing you on the left the proportion of each county's homes that falls into that WUI designation. And here you can see that really a majority to the vast majority of homes in many of the counties, particularly in the West and in the Northeast and Southeast, are falling into WUI designations. But again, as overall area, the highest proportions of county falling into WUI area are primarily on the East Coast. Again, a lot more private land, a long history of housing development, and a lot of forest cover. That's what the WUI looks like for 2010. I've also been telling you that this is a change product. So this is what growth from 1990 to 2010 looks like. The important thing to focus on this map is the sort of beige areas were WUI in 1990 and remain so in 2010. And the red are all the new areas that were recruited into the WUI. And overall, this was pretty rapid growth nationally. This is about a 41% increase in number of houses and a 30% increase in WUI area. And that sort of absolute change in WUI area is basically equivalent in size to the state of Washington, the upper sort of left there. And the other thing we wanted to do with this data was try and consider why we were seeing this growth. Because if you remember, again, this WUI definition is the idea that we have housing and we have the wildland vegetation. And both of those things can change over time. So we did some additional work and found that really it's housing growth that is driving WUI expansion, both in terms of area and houses. So this isn't something where, for example, we're seeing a lot of forest regrowth due to agricultural abandonment. And I mention this because I think there are places in Europe where, for example, land use change has led to sort of changes in vegetation patterns that's brought housing and wildland vegetation in closer proximity. In the US, the pattern really seems to be that housing growth is sort of leading to this expanding interface. And I think that's pretty similar to what we've seen in Australia as well. And then we've done some additional work too to say, okay, well, this Federal Register definition was published in the early 2000s. How does this sort of definition and mapping stack up to where we're seeing losses of buildings? And so this is a paper that Anu Kramer led and was published in 2018. And she took a data set we have of buildings lost to fire from 2000 to 2013 and found that although the WUI makes up about 2% of these fire perimeters by area, it contains 69% of all the buildings lost. And the remainder of the buildings lost are primarily being lost in really sort of lower density rural areas. So in this figure here, A and B are the sort of WUI environments, housing is adjacent to wildland vegetation or intermingled. Most of the losses are coming from there, and the rest are coming primarily from D, these sort of really low density rural areas. Figure C here is an urban area. It's actually an area that was destroyed where fire impacted this area in the Tubbs fire in 2017 in California. Thus far, losses in these really urban areas still remain sort of the anomaly in the US. So again, most of the losses happening in WUI are very rural areas. These data are all available online through University of Wisconsin and the Forest Service. Always happy to chat more with people or direct them to the geospatial data if they're interested. And then I'm going to sort of transition into the second sort of area of research I wanted to touch base on, which is that, okay, we've done all this work documenting that the WUI is growing, that it's present throughout much of the US. But what are some of the sort of ways in which we see these communities adapting or changing over time? And so I've got two sort of studies to present on here. And we did these thinking that, the time after wildfire could be an obvious time where you see adaptation or change. And we did this work with a focus on both local policy and the built environment. And so I'm going to talk about findings from two different studies. The first is a study of sort of local land use policy and community level adaptation to fire that I led. We did the interviews for this about 5 years ago, and the fires themselves were about a decade ago. And this work has been published. And then the second is a study looking at changes in building patterns over time in California, looking at fires from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So moving into this first study here, we had 8 different study sites around the US. This is showing their location. So we wanted to have a diversity of places. And we really sort of focused on interviewing local government leaders, community leaders, people who had helped lead recovery, and talking to them broadly about what at the community level had changed or not post-fire. So we're not focusing on the experience of individual residents, but more the kind of things you can do at the community level. Education campaigns, fuel treatments, changing your land use planning, those kinds of things. And so we've published this study in environmental management, but really what we found was that sort of throughout our study sites, which had very sort of different settings, different sort of past experience with wildfire hazards, we found really like kind of a consistent emphasis on if they were going to change something, they were investing in suppression, emergency evacuation and response, and voluntary efforts to encourage homeowners to mitigate. So these are things like the FireWise program, where you're encouraging people to maintain defensible space, to sort of thin the vegetation around their homes, encouraging them to make upgrades to the materials, encouraging them to be ready to evacuate. We saw a relatively modest change in land use planning. These are sort of those broader documents where a community, local government, or community groups kind of outline sort of the hazard they're facing, the desired end condition. And we really saw minimal change in regulations. These are sort of like the teeth or the way that a community would kind of lay out how they're going to get to that desired result. For example, they might have special requirements for building materials in the WUI. They might have zoning that limits housing densities or certain uses in fire-prone areas, or they can also have regulations around defensible space that has to be maintained. We only had one study site in California that actually has these kind of requirements. California is a bit unique. They've had these requirements sort of statewide for designated zones. But again, because that's sort of a statewide effort, there wasn't a lot of change sort of after a fire event. And then for the rest of our sites, they really didn't have these events and these regulations, and they didn't actually change them after the fire events either. In fact, we had two study sites in Texas and Oklahoma that don't have building codes. They did not acquire building codes after these fire events. And so we wanted to delve a little bit more into sort of some of the challenges people saw with land use planning and regulation. And so we've published this paper in International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction. But this was really interesting to sort of look more. There were a number of ways in which people sort of had concerns about land use planning and regulation, and many of these concerns sort of span sites. And so again, these are interviews talking with the local government officials or community leaders that in many cases sort of have this as part of their portfolio. So I think the first one here, number one, many places people felt like local populations and residents really just did not support land use planning and regulations. Particularly in more rural areas in the US, there can be sort of a strong emphasis on private property rights and people being sort of resistant to the idea of regulation. There were also places that were more rural where people were saying, look, we're a really small government staff. We don't have the resources and capacity to do this. And frankly, even in places that were more resourced, they would say, you know, to be doing sort of defensible space inspections on every single house in the WUI is a tall order. And then moving into 3 and 4 here, these were also really interesting to hear. There were ways in which local government officials themselves thought that it was not necessary to be incorporating wildfire into land use planning and regulation efforts. So they either thought that the fire event that had occurred was going to be a limited occurrence, it wasn't going to reoccur, or they thought these types of approaches were just ineffective. We also had a number of people sort of tell us that really they saw their role, for example, in a building department, in sort of prioritizing housing growth or permitting housing growth and sort of contributing to economic development. And so I think that's an important part to remember as well. There's oftentimes a lot of emphasis on sort of valuing development and growth, particularly in these more rural areas. And then the last point, 5 and 6, these were more from places where I say there had been more land use planning, but say focused on different hazards or different concerns. And so people would say, you know, now we're having to sort of rethink and integrate a completely different hazard. They would say, like, we've had a lot of housing development and we made sure to prioritize open space near communities as a sort of recreational amenity to enhance stormwater management. And now you're telling me that this is a fire concern and I have to rethink everything. And I think that too is also a valuable thing to sort of think about, is sort of how are these land use planning and regulation approaches going to sort of adapt and change over time, particularly after you've already had a lot of development. So that sort of wraps up what I wanted to present about that study. I've got one more study I wanted to touch base on. This is a study that Anu Kramer at University of Wisconsin led. She was looking at change in the built environment in California after fire. These are fires from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. There were 11 of them. She used digital imagery and public records to create a long-term GIS database of the buildings lost, the buildings rebuilt, and then newly built. So meaning within the fire perimeter, where do you have buildings being built where there weren't any buildings before? And then again, she followed these fires out long-term to try and just track rebuilding and new development, and then also look at the risk specific to individual building locations. So for each one of these fire perimeters, she built a sort of statistical model that looked at the likelihood that a building was going to be lost based on landscape level features, things like, distance to road, topography, distance to town, distance to public land. And then she used those models to sort of examine the locations that were being rebuilt to see if on average we had sort of a transition towards building in less risky locations, building in more risky locations. And so the first slide here is just showing you what building looks like in each one of these fires over time. You can see these are sort of throughout California. Because these are fires from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, for the most part, these are relatively small losses, right? These are not, the paradises with 18,000 buildings. I think the largest loss we see here is in the 1991 Oakland Hills fire. So that's sort of a helpful one to look at if you kind of go all the way over to the left. And here you can see this blue line is showing you the buildings lost in fire goes down to sort of negative 2,500, and within 5 years, those buildings are rebuilt. There's not a lot of new development in this fire. That's that orange line. This is a very dense area. It's just outside Berkeley. There frankly really wasn't room for housing development. But you can see that long term, the fire sort of didn't sort of change, I guess, the level of development because most of the houses were rebuilt. We also didn't have a lot of new development within that perimeter. The other perimeters, for the most part, sort of show the opposite pattern. So not a lot of losses. The rebuilding sort of is happening over time, but the really dominant trend here is that there's been a lot of new development within fire perimeters. So over time, say 20 years later, you're seeing a big sort of increase in many of these fires in the number of buildings within the fire perimeters, much of it from new development. So again, I think as this talk has probably made clear, land use is very decentralized in the US. It really all falls to sort of the local government and institution. So this is just an observational study of the buildings, but I think it's safe to conclude that there were not policy interventions in the intervening time that really sort of discouraged development in many of these perimeters. And then the second analysis she did was looking at the risk specific to the individual building location. And so this figure here is just showing you at the wildfire level, do we see on average a change towards building in less risky locations in the blue, no change in the gray, or higher risk in the brown? And we've broken this out by the short-term rebuilding and new development and the long-term rebuilding and new development. And I think the sort of takeaway from here is that there really is no consistent trend towards reducing risk over either the short or the long term. We do see more of these fires in that sort of blue category with sort of trending towards lower risk locations over the short term, both for rebuilding and new building, but there's still the sort of minority among these fires, right? Mostly what we're seeing is not a lot of change or higher risk. And then also long term, that's sort of the majority of what we're seeing, right? And I should say too, these bars are sort of changing because only for some of these fires do we have the sort of longest time frame of data. So, there are obviously some caveats with this type of work. We don't know what homeowners were doing on the ground to mitigate. These are just, these are buildings that were sort of appearing on these aerial images. So they could have been rebuilt with much better materials. In 1991 in California, they did have sort of statewide policy reforms that came in after that Oakland Hills fire. And so California does have sort of statewide places where there are regulations on the materials and the defensible space. But overall, I would say the work we've done so far on rebuilding after fire and these sort of policy interviews would suggest that wildfire experience does not always lead to sort of a transformation in policy or the built environment. I think one thing that comes out in both these studies is that there is a lot of pressure for development Particularly California, I think, there's a lot of discussion about housing, affordability, and availability. I do have some caveats in that these fire events were smaller scale than, like, for example, the recent losses we've seen in Northern California. So the fire events where I was going to different communities and talking to local government and land use planners, these were events where we were losing, maximum a couple hundred homes. So I think it remains to be seen sort of how some of these questions around land use are going to be changing. I think California has had a lot of legislative activity actually on sort of wildfire related concerns. So it'll be interesting to see sort of where that continues to go. And so that wraps up, I think, the information I was going to present today in terms of discussion and sort of what's coming next. I think it'll be interesting to see, with the exception of maybe California, I think there's a lot of work people could do in sort of thinking through land use, and in particular trying to think about climate change and sort of how wildfire mitigation is going to need to try and sort of keep pace with the development and climate as we continue to see changes. I've also touched base in a couple of places about sort of ways in which I wish we had better data in the US. So I think worth sort of pointing that out as well. It would be great to have a national data set on housing footprints. We don't have sort of spatially explicit records on where we lose housing due to fire. Like the work I'm talking about, we've actually had students digitizing building locations. At a national level, we do report up after wildfire incidents, the number of houses and outbuildings lost, but there aren't spatially explicit data collected. So I would love to see that change. And then finally, I think it's worth mentioning that we know very little about the social impacts of wildfire. So I am sure that it's the same as other hazards where there are going to be ways in which wildfire impacts and recovery are more challenging for people that are socioeconomically disadvantaged. But I don't think we have any great long-term studies looking at outcomes, looking at, mitigation decisions, migration decisions. A lot of that is still really unknown. And then the last point I wanted to make is that I was on a paper recently where we tried to think through some of the ways in which wildfire recovery, we could try and marry the ecological and social data and try and better understand sort of fire risk. Because I've been focusing a lot about these changes in the built environment, but we know too that we're seeing a lot of ecological changes as well. And I think we need to really try and sort of bring both of those worlds together to really think about sort of wildfire recovery and future exposure. So that wraps up the talk today. I want to thank you guys again so much for being here, and also acknowledge all of the people that have provided funding or contributed to the project. And thank you again.
Thank you so much for that. Terrific talk. And we can open the floor up for questions for sure, because we've got time. And if you'd like to ask a question, we'll go follow the usual rules of just please raise your virtual hand, and we'll roll on from there. Floor is open. I'm sure people have questions. If you don't, then I do.
I see one person with their hand up.
Do we have a hand?
Yeah, Mary Edwards.
Yes, Mary, please.
Hi. Thanks so much for that talk. That's it's really interesting. Yeah, I've got several questions actually, but maybe starting when you talked about small rural communities have very few resources to do anything actually, so it's not on the top of their agenda to maybe change their rules or particularly patrol what's going on. I just wondered what the local or regional fire and rescue community thinks about this in the sense that they're the ones that have to go in and try to rescue people.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think worth sort of pointing out too that probably in many places around the world, a smaller rural community has a lot of resources to draw on in terms of like their social cohesion and their sort of long-term knowledge of the environment. It's just that they maybe are not necessarily invested in sort of local government services. And so fire departments are really interesting. Those, much like the rest of everything I've been talking about, are very decentralized. And so there are a lot of places in the US where it's primarily like a rural volunteer fire department that is responding. Sometimes it's a mixture of sort of paid staff and volunteer staff. And I think they have a lot of really valuable insight. I've certainly talked to people who feel like they're sort of trying to straddle the line between sort of local government and sort of community residents. And oftentimes they're really sort of respected and valued by community residents because they play such an important role. And so they're sort of turning around and saying to government, like, look, you know, you've had this housing development go in. We really need to work on like some of the basic things. Like I remember one place where the fire department had a big push for getting reflective signs, like literally sort of street signs, because they felt they weren't going to be able to see them if there was a fire and there's low visibility because of smoke. So I would say like rural fire departments are kind of caught between these forces, but I also think are really great ambassadors and allies and really sort of have their finger on the pulse of what a lot of residents and communities are thinking about too.
Yeah, thanks.
Mary, if you have more questions, you should fire away. We've got time.
Why don't you go next, Eli? We can see, and then somebody else has got their hand raised now, so that's good.
Great. Where do we see the next? Where do we see the next hand? Who was it?
It looks like Daniela.
There we go.
It's me. Hi.
Yay.
Thanks for the talk. I think this talk is really related to the conversation we had past week about the insurance system, but it was more about hurricane seasons and everything. And in the USA has these fire seasons too. I mean, everyone knows that in time to time, some forests will burn. Unfortunately, houses come with it. And with that, again, planning risk and how we assess that in the planning system, especially for housing, is quite important. So what are the changes you in your research have found towards the years, and how this risk, especially this risk, has been inserted in the housing, how they plan this system?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think there's like a couple of things. Were you guys talking about the US system of floodplain insurance? Yeah. So homeowners insurance for fire is just sort of the private homeowners insurance, the same that would cover you if like a hailstorm damaged your house. And so that's been really interesting to follow, because up until now, for the most part, losses from wildfire have still been relatively small. Like if you look at all the damages to homeowners insurance from wind, it's far greater. If you look at homeowners losses to just like kind of house fires, like, you know, you leave a toaster oven or a space heater on and cause a fire, that's usually actually still been higher than wildfire losses. But we are starting to see changes, particularly because there are like in California, there have been these concentrations, these large losses. So California has had to stand up this thing. This is decades old at this point, called Fair Plan Insurance. It's sort of like a state-run sort of insurer where if you can't get private homeowners insurance, you can pay for this. It is more expensive and the coverage isn't as good. And so people, I think, would prefer not to be on that. But it has been this sort of interesting situation where I think homeowners sometimes will say, like, look, I've been doing mitigation, I changed my roof, I did this defensible space maintenance. How come that isn't reflected in the coverage available to me or the price I'm paying for the homeowner's insurance? And I think that's been sort of challenging as well, because you can't, these are private for-profit businesses. And so a lot of the information on risk and premiums is proprietary. So we can't really have them all sort of sharing and having one sort of universal risk model. And so I think then it's been a tough thing to figure out. I think California is having sort of some recent local actions where they want to kind of stand up sort of a program where they say, like, if people are doing voluntary mitigation, let's try and get that to translate into changes in the insurance industry. The other thing I would say too is that in discussing sort of how decentralized housing growth and development is in the US, the folks that are sort of permitting housing development are not the people that are paying for wildfire suppression or recovery. And that's, I think, the same for many hazards, including like flooding and hurricanes, right?
Thanks.
Other questions? Keep them coming.
Eli, what are these students mostly study? Are they focused on hazards closer to home in
Oh,
Europe, everything?
We have a mix of students and staff, and it's a mix of like it's geographies writ large, so not necessarily just sort of hazard facing people.
Okay.
So it's we've got a pretty general audience in terms of, like, interests from all sorts of sectors. Mary, you're back.
There's another question. DB has a question.
Hiya. I just want to say thank you so much for this, because I think it's really interesting. I was just wondering, how much of a part does prediction play in terms of predicting wildfires? Is that something that is actively done, and is it effective? Yeah.
Oh yeah, so that's not stuff I work on as directly. So, this will probably be sort of my takeaway, but there's tremendous effort in investing in wildfire hazard ratings, predictions, like trying to prioritize where we're going to do fuel treatments, trying to understand sort of local weather conditions. So I think one thing that's made the news past couple of years is that in Northern California, they've gotten to the point where they're so concerned about sort of wind and weather conditions, they're sort of proactively instituting power cutoffs because they don't want the power lines to be sort of damaged and start wildfires. I think a lot of people feel like that approach could be fine-tuned to prevent sort of widespread blackouts. So that's, I think, something that's still being worked on in Northern California, but also too in the US, we tend to study, I would say, fires in the Great Plains a lot less from sort of maybe more this like kind of social science point of view than fires in forested environments. And those are like grass and sort of wind-driven fires. And they've got these really sort of sophisticated weather and wind forecasting systems that they put up, and, sort of trying to predict fire behavior. And obviously a big part of that too is trying to sort of restrict use of fire during times of high fire damage. So no prescribed burning, no burning your trash, no campfires, that kind of thing.
Do you think there's a disconnect between going back to California, because that's what I know, because my partner's family's from there, and they've had their own experiences with fires, with what the state of California, Cal Fire, or even the insurance companies would like to be in place in the way of regulations or rules or building codes versus the I can't see it changing, everybody has a right to do what they want, small government kind of trend in land use planning. I mean, are they ever going to be able to come together in something more joined up?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think California is always interesting because, as with so many things, they tend to sort of lead the nation, right? So they develop fuel efficiency standards and car makers sort of try and comply, and the rest of us kind of follow. So they have been consistent leaders in, like, they have statewide fire hazard severity zones mapped. They have requirements for defensible space. And after the past couple of years, the legislative activity is really ticked up. I think the part that's hard is that they're at this point now trying to meet so many different demands. So talking to people about sort of wildfire recovery in Butte County, which contains Paradise, and they'll say, what is fair and equitable from a housing perspective and a hazard perspective? Does everybody have to live in the urban center of Chico? Is it okay for people to live in Paradise? Sort of what is affordable? What has the equitable hazard risk? And so they're trying to accomplish a lot of different policy goals, and I think it can be challenging. And then California as itself is a very diverse state, right? So from big urban centers to really rural places, from all kinds of political leanings and views on land use regulations. They also have a very large and very effective firefighting entity. So I don't know if that answered your question, other than just I agree, it's fascinating.
Oh, it's great. Thanks. DB, I can see a DB with a hand up.
Oh yeah, this is me again. Something that I read about wildfires a couple of weeks ago was that indigenous and native communities in the past have been doing their own kind of wildfire management techniques. So I was wondering if there's any evidence of, like, in terms of like Native American settlements and I forgot what they're called, but communities, do they deal with wildfires differently today compared to other areas in the States?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's not something I've studied specifically, but yes, in general, like, indigenously held lands, they're their own government, their own they have kind of their own administration sort of within the US. And so they'll have their own natural resource management staff and their own sort of prescribed fire practices. But I mean, I certainly see news articles as well about sort of California trying to increase prescribed fire, the role of tribal peoples and tribal lands in increasing that. I don't know if I have sort of like firsthand knowledge on sort of who's doing what, other than that in general, there's a lot of interest in that. In the US, the Southeast is actually the region that does the most sort of prescribed burning. So I think too, there's an interest in trying to sort of marry all of these different traditions and sort of techniques and learning. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
My question had to do with what you're seeing, what your sense of the fire risk is in sort of the extraterritorial parts of the U.S. You said that, so you've got the coterminous lower 48 there, but like what does it look like in the Caribbean based on the data that you've seen?
Yeah, so I haven't actually seen the data yet from Puerto Rico. That would be interesting to see because they've had like sort of a different land use kind of story than much of the rest of the US. They've had a lot of sort of like urbanization and then sort of regrowth. It's not typically, I believe, a climate where we're as concerned about wildfire risk. I would say the place where we don't have data where it would be nice to is actually Alaska. There's a lot of concern, I think, from more sort of this ecological carbon sequestration perspective about fire in Alaska. And I think there's housing development in rural parts of Alaska too. So it's not that it's the part of the country perhaps most at risk to have housing loss due to fire, but I think it's an area where we are seeing increased fire activity.
Well, that's our hour. Thank you again for now. It's been wonderful to have you, and a great talk and great questions afterwards from the assembled crew. So thank you for that. And yeah, this will be, we'll pop this online. This will join the other seminars in this series, and so yeah, we look forward to work that continues to come out of your work and your collaborations. It's wonderful stuff.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, and please do feel free to follow up if I can share more information. That'd be great.
Thanks so much.
Okay, have a good afternoon.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.